Much, Payman. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. Inviting me to speak to everybody today. I'm going to try and stay on schedule as much as possible and go through my slides at quite a breakneck speed. So, Payman, my slides are not moving. Ah, there we are. Is that looking okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Can you let me know, Payman? Thank you very much. So just very quickly, my background. We just heard Raja say it's ironic nobody's speaking their mother language today on International Mother Language Day. I actually am. I'm perhaps a bit of an exception in the British interpreting circles, being a native British person who migrated to a different country when I was very young. I grew up in the Netherlands. I learned Dutch along with the Dutch kids at primary and secondary school, and then I completed my education here in the UK at the University of Hull, where I did my bachelor's in Dutch and French and my master's in European Studies, and then did my DPSI in Dutch and English law in 2005, and I joined the National Register almost immediately, and I've been involved with the Register in various ways for quite a long time. I've been a member of the disciplinary committee panel from 2011 to 2019, and then joined the board as a practitioner member just recently last year. Hence, I presume the reason I was invited to come and speak today about the NRPSI Code of Professional Conduct. Just a quick outline of my talk today. I was asked to speak a little bit about some basic concepts of interpreting and translation, first of all, by way of introduction, and then I'll be covering some aspects of NRPSI's code. Again, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the code. We don't have time to cover it in depth, but I'll be speaking about the general lead concepts within the code of integrity, competence, confidentiality and impartiality, and responsibility and disclosure. And I hope that everybody will take away at least one useful tip from this that they can put into their interpreting practice. So the basics, the difference between interpreting and translation. I think this is a bugbear for all of us when the media incorrectly report interpreters as translators and vice versa. But to put it very simply, interpreting pertains to the spoken word and translation pertains to the written word. Some of us are just interpreters, some of us are translators, and some of us do both. Different modes of interpreting. The main modes are consecutive, where the interpreter waits for the speaker to finish before they render the message into the other language. Usually it assists the interpreter to have the speech cut up into fairly small chunks, but sometimes interpreters might be expected to take more extensive notes and render a longer passage. And then simultaneous, where effectively we interpret at the same time as the speaker is speaking. Nowadays, we are increasingly availing ourselves of equipment in order to be able to do that more seamlessly. But of course, there's also the old-fashioned practice of whispered interpreting, where you are really sitting next to your end client and whispering simultaneously. This is not something that you can keep up for a great deal of time, because it puts a lot of strain on your voice. And then this diagram at the bottom shows you the triangle that really should be existent in every single interpreter-client-principal interaction. If there aren't three of you in the room, you're not interpreting. So again, avoid being left alone with clients at police stations or in waiting rooms, if you possibly can, would be my tip. And always remind the principal that really, unless there are three of you in the room, you're not interpreting. Types of interpreting and interpreting settings. My career started out in public service interpreting, which here in the United Kingdom tends to consist mostly of police and court work, but also medical appointments, local government work such as helping people with their benefits appointments, for example, job centre appointments, and community interpreting. In the last 10 years, I personally have started doing a lot more commercial interpreting, which involves interpreting at conferences like this one. I've got to say, this is the first time I've been on the front end of Zoom. Usually I am lurking in the shadows on the back end of Zoom, providing simultaneous interpreting to speakers and not having to worry about next slides on the PowerPoint. Within commercial interpreting, as I said, booth interpreting at conferences is probably the main mode. Sometimes people will need to build in a relay if not everybody can directly interpret into every language. So I'll give you an example. If we're at a conference and the Dutch delegate who I am interpreting for wants to contribute something to the meeting, he will say it in Dutch, I will render it in English, and all of the other booths, so the French, the Italian, the Spanish, the German booth at that conference will have to listen to my English rendition before they can put it into their respective target languages. So that's what's meant by relay interpreting. The main settings in which we interpret are face-to-face settings, and increasingly in these challenging times over the last 2 years, we are doing a lot more remote work, which also, like I said, tends to be paired with the use of equipment and platforms like Zoom. I should say, actually, recently when I went to work in one of the courts here in the UK, I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that they've started to invest in some tour guide equipment, which does allow you to interpret simultaneously without actually having to sit next to the person in the dock who may have come from a prison where there may be quite a lot of COVID. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, a big leap forward. The recognition by the courts now that equipment does help us in our work. Just a moment. I was asked to speak briefly about dress code. Just a second, I need to just have a quick sip of water. There isn't anything in the NRPSI's code of conduct regarding the dress code particularly, other than that we should present ourselves in a professional manner. My advice would be to consider the setting that you're working in. So if you're working in court, you want to look just as professional as every other fee earner who's there at court. So wear a suit. If you're a woman and you're wearing a sleeveless dress with a suit jacket over the top, you shouldn't really be taking your jacket off in the courtroom. This is actually a rule of the courts that ladies should have their arms, their upper arms covered. Anyway, everywhere else, general business wear. So if you're a man, a shirt and a tie and smart trousers. If you're a woman, you probably have a little bit more freedom in what is considered smart casual business wear. I know some countries and cultures tend to have maybe different standards. For example, I know in some hotter countries, it's quite normal and acceptable business wear to wear Bermuda shorts with a shirt and tie. Fortunately, here in the UK, it's generally too cold for that sort of thing. The Linguist Collective has created some very nice looking reference material if you need to check any of the do's and don'ts regarding the dress code. Then you can find that in the on the Linguist dashboard under the CPD section, if I'm not mistaken, and also under the FAQs. Now then, to the main meat of the presentation. The Linguist Collective has decided to adopt NRPSI's Code of Professional Conduct as its Code of Professional Conduct, and quite rightly so. It's a high standard, and it's a standard that should give users of interpreting services a high level of confidence in the people who go out and work through the Linguist Collective. Just a few words about the National Register here in the United Kingdom. It's a voluntary regulator, so effectively interpreters who are registered on the register pay our registration fee in order to be regulated by the register. Anybody on the register, just like anybody working for Linguist Collective, has to be qualified, experienced and vetted, and we all agree to follow the NRPSI Code of Professional Conduct. If you want to take a look at the code, I've created this tiny URL link, which is just a short link to the NRPSI's website, or you can obviously find it on this much longer web address. And just to give you some indication of how the disciplinary framework of NRPSI is structured, we have 3 levels of committee that will consider complaints that come in from users of interpreting services or users of interpreters who are registered with the register. In the first place, a complaint will be considered by the Professional Conduct Committee. They may feel it's within their capability to deal with it. If it's deemed too serious for the PCC to deal with, they'll refer it upwards to the DC, and effectively the complaints are dealt with by way of a hearing where parties are invited to come and really talk about what happened in the situation complained about. And as always, in any complaints procedure, there is a further level where registrants can appeal the outcome of a disciplinary hearing that they don't agree with. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you a slide with some further links, which also includes where NRPSI publishes short summaries of the outcomes of our disciplinary hearings. Oh, sorry, I should also mention the soon-to-be launched, or actually recently launched, I should say, National Register of Public Service Translators, which is a new initiative by NRPSI to provide effectively the same service of qualified, registered, vetted individuals who are competent to do the job, just in respect of translation as opposed to interpreting. So there will be many people who will be registered on both registers. This is what our Code of Professional Conduct looks like. Quite daunting, 7 pages. It breaks down into 6 sections and 57 individual edicts within that, 57 items of code. And the last time it was updated was 2016. I'm not aware that there are any plans to update the code anytime soon, but I could imagine that now that our working practices have changed somewhat with the amount of remote work that we've started doing, that it may be necessary to put some additional clauses in there. Although at the moment, really the code does seem to cover most eventualities. This is what it looks like. Don't worry, I'm not going to take us through every single page of the code. I just wanted to show you the different sections that it consists of. So section 1, definitions, then the second section, general framework, 3, overarching principles, 4, the obligations to our principals, to our clients. Number 5 is specific to interpreting work, and number 6 is specific to translation work. So there are some definitions provided at the head of our Code of Professional Conduct. So NRPSI should need no explanation. That's the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. A practitioner, now that's you, the interpreter. Same for 1.6, a public service interpreter, same thing, practitioner. And your 1.7 also registrant really means the same thing. So it defines who the code applies to: interpreters who are registered with the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. The 1.3, the definition of principal. The principal is the person who has contracted you to do the work. So there will probably be one of the people in the room in your interpreting session. There will be you, the principal, and usually the end user. The code under 1.5, that pertains to the Code of Professional Conduct of NRPSI. And work, I think, is probably pretty self-explanatory. So to whom do we as interpreters have obligations and responsibilities? There are three main groups, really. First of all, as mentioned, to our principals and to the end clients of those principals. So in other words, our end users of our language services. In the second place, we all hold a responsibility to the profession at large. We don't want to show up our colleagues. We don't want to make the reputation of our professional bodies suffer through our bad behaviour. And then lastly, we have a responsibility to the general public and wider society. And that's another reason why we have the Code of Professional Conduct, in order to have accountability towards those three groups, and in order to give the public and users of interpreting services confidence in what we do. So I want to talk about the core values that the Code of Professional Conduct contains. I would say that these really are the four main pillars of our code: integrity, competence, confidentiality and impartiality, and responsibility and disclosure. In one way, you could say that everything that we do depends on personal integrity, because a lot of the time it's left up to us as freelance practitioners to police ourselves and to police our own practice, and to constantly reflect on our own practice, whether we are actually doing it right, because there isn't always another party that's capable of judging whether, first of all, we are doing things right on a linguistic level, but secondly, whether we're doing things right on an ethical level. So really, the issue of integrity is very much in the hands of the individual interpreter. I'm just going to take a short drink while you ponder these recent headlines from the United Kingdom. So really what I want to say about this slide is don't do this. One of the items in our professional code actually does specify that we are not permitted to engage in any criminal behaviour in our interpreting practice. I think you can see in these headlines that there is quite a lot of scope for criminal parties to want to seek to coerce interpreters, whether that's in order to cheat in a driving test, or in far more nefarious, far higher value criminal trials and so forth. Obviously, these types of stories give us all a terribly bad name. And I should add, one or two of the people who those headlines relate to were National Register interpreters, and they have now been expelled from the register. With these different colour codings, I just wanted to show that these pillars, these different core values, run through the different items of the code, and I just tried to classify them a little bit according to what I felt was the main value that was expressed in each of the items in our code. So these are our overarching principles. You'll see, as far as I'm concerned, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 really are matters of personal integrity. And once again, let me re-emphasize, we as freelance individuals really go about our work without a great deal of checks and controls being put on us, really, until the point that something goes wrong. So the responsibility is ours to make sure that we don't overstretch ourselves, which brings me to the point of competence. There are quite a few items in our code that tell us we should only work in areas that we are competent and skilled to work in. So I'm looking at the blue column here for competence, for example, 3.8, we should only work in the areas of linguistic competence that we have. And 3.9, that competence pertains to making sure that you understand someone who might speak a different dialect, and to making sure that you have the right cultural and socio-political knowledge to be able to understand really where that person is coming from and what they are actually saying. Again, in our section 4, we have a number of points that pertain to competence. For example, 4.6, if you have to subcontract, if you're going to subcontract a job, you have to make sure that you are satisfied the colleague that you are asking to do the work is just as competent as you are, if not more so. This is your responsibility, and this is something that you sign up to by signing up to this code. Here under section 5, we have a lot of points that, to my mind, relate hugely to competence. For example, 5.2 of the NRPSI Code of Professional Conduct specifies that people should only work in their registered languages. However, there is an exception to that rule, which is expressed in 5.3, which says effectively, if the principal insists that let me just find it for you, 5.3, if the principal insists that you can do this job, there we are. If a principal requests that the practitioner interpret between languages in which the practitioner is competent at the required level, but which are not registered, as in registered with the National Register, as in 5.2, the practitioner may proceed provided that the conditions of 5.1 are satisfied and that the principal has been made aware of the potential disadvantages of proceeding. So, in other words, if you have the competence in a language for which you're not registered with the National Register, you have to inform your principal that that's the case. And as I say, or as the code says, rather, make them aware of any potential disadvantages of using you for that job, even though you might not be registered. So the disadvantages I'm thinking of, for example, you might not be insured properly to do that work, depending on what your insurance policy says. So once again, it boils down to your personal integrity as a linguist. It's you that's having to make the judgment call. Now, this yellow column, confidentiality and impartiality, I think we can probably gloss over that fairly quickly, except that in the sense that I think we all understand we owe a duty of confidentiality and impartiality to the people that we interpret for. There's one exception to that here in, sorry, let me go back, in 314. If a disclosure is required by law, then that is the one exception when you do have to disclose information. In other words, if a court orders you to do so. The only other exception that I would say that we all need to be mindful of is in cases of suspected child abuse, if or any other vulnerable end user who confides something in you that hasn't come out in the interpreting session that you think a social worker or your principal needs to be informed about from a safeguarding point of view in order to safeguard that individual, then that is obviously another situation where confidentiality really goes out of the window. But as I said, unless there are 3 of you in the room, you are not really interpreting. So if proper practice is followed, that scenario shouldn't really occur where an end user is saying something to you privately that you aren't then immediately interpreting out loud for the benefit of the principal who is also in the room with you. So I think we can take confidentiality and impartiality as read. Your responsibility to maintain confidentiality is something that continues after the assignment has ended, which is expressed in point 313 of the code. And also, I just want to stress this 3.17 of not having any contact with the end user. This is really for your own protection, and to avoid any untoward accusations or anybody trying to coerce you or so on. Just don't give out your phone number. Refer your principal back to the agency. This is quite standard practice that you don't offer lifts to people when you're leaving the job, that sort of thing. So the purple column, responsibility and disclosure. There are times in your interpreting practice when the onus is on you to speak out. For example, in the example of where was it, 5.2, 5.2 and 5.3 that I mentioned earlier, where you are required to make the principal aware of any limitations that there might be. So looking here under 5, and especially at the purple column, there are quite a number of points under which the code requires you to speak out or to take personal responsibility and make sure that your principal is aware of certain factors. So you, for example, are expected to disclose any difficulties relating to the limitations of your own competence. If you are struggling, don't just soldier on. You have a responsibility to your client to make it clear that you're having difficulties. Similarly, at 5.10, ensure that you have the necessary working conditions. If I can remind you of the interpreting triangle several slides ago, it's up to you really to make sure that people are sitting in the right place where you can effectively do your work. It's up to you to let people know if the equipment provided isn't suitable for what needs to be done. You are the person who is the professional with the knowledge and the skills about how the interpreting session really ought to run. So the responsibility is yours to assist the other parties in making it run as smoothly as possible. I'm just looking at these 5 points at the bottom of this table. So 5.10, we need to ensure necessary, the correct working conditions are there. There are a number of clauses that tell us the circumstances under which we ought to withdraw from a job. That's usually if we lack the competence, then obviously we're about as useful as a chocolate teapot. So don't overstretch yourself in jobs that you know you are basically not going to be any help. But also there might be situations where you have a conflict for another reason. For example, because you've already interpreted for a different defendant in the same case at an earlier stage of an investigation, or because in a family case you have already interpreted for the other party and it's a terribly acrimonious case. So this is what code item number 514 relates to, which tells you you have to make your principal aware of any factors like that that could affect the outcome of the interpreting session. So I just want to summarize really how much in all 4 of these main areas that run through the, what was it, 57 items of the code of the Code of Professional Conduct, how much of it really is in your hands and is down to your judgment and your responsibility and your ability to be self-reflective, self-critical, and to know your limitations. I just want to focus briefly on one item which talks about certain interventions that we have to make as interpreters in order to make sure that the communication is working the way it ought to. According to point 512 of the Code of Professional Conduct of NRPSI, we interpreters shall not interrupt, pause, or intervene except either to ask for clarification, to point out that something's not been properly understood, or that something's been incorrectly assumed by one party or another. Number 3, to let people know that there's potentially been a missed cultural reference. Or lastly, to signal that there may be other problems that are going to impede the interpreting session. So as I mentioned, for example, the way people are positioned, or the sound quality coming through the technical equipment, or so on. So, I mean, how do you really do that? I'm always reminded of the scenario where you're interpreting at a medical setting and the doctor says to your end user, so tell me what the trouble is. And your end user says, oh, it's terrible, doctor. I just can't stop going to the toilet all the time. And in fact, I really feel the urge to go for a pee right now. And you as the interpreter say, it's terrible, doctor. I have the urge to go to the toilet all the time. And in fact, I feel the need to go for a pee right now. And the doctor looks at you and says, well, Mr. Interpreter, surely you knew you were coming for this appointment. Couldn't you have gone beforehand? You all see the problem. We interpret in the first person, and we effectively become the first person voice of the person we're interpreting for. So the way to avoid this confusion, and this trick has other benefits as well, is to ensure that when you're intervening, you refer to yourself in the third person as the interpreter. Examples: the interpreter needs a break. The interpreter is struggling to find the correct term. The interpreter needs to correct something. A moment ago, when the interpreter said this, the interpreter actually meant to say that. Or the all-time, this is the best use of the interpreter in the third person. The interpreter made a mistake. It's part of our code to be able to own up to making an error. Sometimes if you're in a very intensive interpreting session, you don't actually realize until after you've said something and you're on to the next question in cross-examination that actually that wasn't quite accurate. That wasn't quite what the witness said. So this is where it's very useful to be able to say, Your Honour, the interpreter made a mistake. Not only does it signal that you are speaking as the interpreter and not as the person in the witness box, but it actually, I personally find it psychologically exceedingly useful because it allows you to distance yourself from your mistake a little bit and to kind of rise above it and criticize it on a more metaphysical level. So this is my takeaway tip for your practice. Try and get in the habit of, if you need to interject anything in your capacity as the interpreter, refer to yourself as the interpreter to avoid all confusion for your principals, end users, and anybody else in the interpreting process. Now, I know that was rather a quick tour through our Code of Professional Conduct. I just wanted to say a few more words about the Section 6 of the Code, which really has the same basic principles as Section 5 relating to the interpreting do's and don'ts, just pertaining to translation. I think if you could spend some time reading NRPSI's code in full and reflecting on these ideas of integrity, competence, confidentiality, and the responsibility of disclosure from time to time, that will help you it will help you navigate your way through the code, and it will also help you to realize that it's us as individual freelance practitioners who are responsible for maintaining the standard of our profession. So, you know, it's down to you to follow the code and to implement the code in your working practice. I've just got a few links for you. Finally, so nrpsi.org.uk is the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. The next link down, NRPST, is the newly launched National Register of Public Service Translators. This is the NRPSI's company link on LinkedIn. Our code of conduct is online. We also have an annual review that's published annually, funnily enough. And if you want to read more about the NRPSI's disciplinary procedures and frameworks, there's a link for that. And if you want to see the published outcomes of the cases that go before the DC and the PC, no, just the DC, sorry, I don't know if the PCC's outcomes are published. You'll have to check it out for yourselves. And just to close off, I'd just like to say my experience, as well as being a panel member on the DC, the disciplinary committee of NRPSI. Sometimes it's exceedingly gratifying to see that actually an interpreter has done everything by the book, has done everything by the code, and that there is really sometimes no complaint for them to answer. Equally, it can be very satisfying to be able to put errant interpreters back on the right path. Lastly, if anybody who is an NRPSI registered interpreter feels that they could help us fill the vacancy on our board, please express your interest. And also, NRPSI is currently recruiting for a new chairman. Payman, back over to you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, and there is one question in the chat for you as well, Madeleine, if you're happy to answer, which is that some principals prefer to use your name during sessions. And how do you distance yourself in that situation?
I think the same principle still applies. I mean, personally, I find in the courts, they tend to address you as Madam or Mr. Interpreter. You are quite right that in some settings, in order to actually be able to properly assist the people you're interpreting for, it helps to be able to connect with them on a more personal level. But genuinely, I think for the benefit of clarity, if you are having to intervene as the interpreter in order to draw the principal's attention to something that isn't working right, or that you need changing, or that you need to correct the record on, I still say that using the phrase of the interpreter, you know, needs this, needs that, needs a comfort break, whatever, is still perfectly appropriate in those circumstances. I suppose if you really have a problem with being addressed by your first name, you can always let them know that how you prefer to be addressed. Yeah, I don't think it changes the principle of being able to affect the process by referring to yourself in the third person.